Welcome to our deep dive today. It's about, this recent news story that's sparked a bit of debate, Just imagine, like, if someone told you that you couldn't use a certain word anymore, a word that you just, you feel like is pretty standard, how would you react? That's the situation that the Associated Press, they found themselves in recently, after President Trump decided to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America.
It's certainly been fascinating, like a case study of the power of words. And yeah, the relationship between the White House and the press, it can be rocky sometimes.
For sure. So let's rewind a little bit to the beginning of President Trump's term back in 2025. He signs his Executive Order 14172, renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. And he even declares February 9th Gulf of America Day. It was a bold move, picture, and, right away it raises some eyebrows.
And it's not even the only name change either. Remember Denali, the tallest mountain in North America? Yeah. Well, he decided to revert it back to Mount McKinley. I mean, that move was especially unpopular in Alaska.
Yeah, that's right. And then we have the Associated Press, the AP, a major global news organization, right? They decide to stick with Gulf of Mexico in their reporting. They cite consistency for their international audience. Of course, they acknowledge, Trump's renaming in their coverage. But the name they mainly use is the original name.
Yeah, you can see why the AP might want to keep things consistent, especially when you consider, like, their global reach, right? Imagine if you had to explain this to someone in the UK who's only ever known it as the Gulf of Mexico. It just adds another layer of complexity to understanding the region.
Totally. But the White House wasn't exactly thrilled with the AP's decision. Things start heating up, and there's this series of events that really highlights the power dynamics here.
Yeah. It starts with the White House, barring AP reporters from certain events like a press conference with the Indian Prime Minister and some Oval Office appearances. It's like, this slow escalation, a series of moves, sending a message.
And then boom, the big one. They're banned from Air Force One. You've got these AP reporters ready to go, cleared security, right? And then suddenly, nope, not you guys. Can you tell us a bit about, the history of the White House press pool? Like, why would being banned from Air Force One be such a big deal?
Well, the press pool. It's a group of journalists who travel with the president. They have access to events, briefings, things like that. And it's there to make sure that there's consistent coverage of the president's activities. It's really a cornerstone of press freedom. And the tradition, it goes way back, all the way back to 1881. There was an AP reporter who sat outside President Garfield's sick room for weeks, providing updates to other journalists. That level of access, it's vital for keeping the public informed. So being banned from Air Force One, it's more than just an inconvenience. It's a symbolic act. It limits their ability to do their jobs.
Right. And then it really gets to the heart of the First Amendment, right? The AP, they argued that this was just a blatant attempt to control the press and limit their freedom of speech.
Oh, absolutely. The First Amendment. It protects the freedom of the press, and that includes, the right to report the news without the government interfering. And this whole situation, it raises the question, does the White House even have the right to tell the press how to refer to geographic locations, especially when those locations extend beyond the U.S. borders?
Yeah. And this wasn't just like a domestic issue, right? This sparked reactions from all over the world.
Absolutely. Some countries, like the UK, they sided with the AP, they stuck with Gulf of Mexico, but other countries, well, they had different reactions.
Yeah, like Mexico, they weren't too keen on the name change. I mean, they straight up refused to recognize Gulf of America. And they even proposed America Mexicana as an alternative. It's just fascinating to see, this kind of debate spill over into international relations and how different cultures, they see it so differently.
Even tech companies, they got caught in the crossfire. Google Maps, for example, they started showing Gulf of America for U.S. users, but for everyone else, Gulf of Mexico. It created this weird digital divide where the name you saw depended on where you were.
Wow, it's amazing how something as simple as a name change can trigger such a complex chain of events with, implications for journalism, international relations, even technology.
This situation, it really highlights that back and forth between the president and the press, which, I mean, it's not new, right? I mean, think about FDR's fireside chats. He used the radio to basically bypass the press. Or even further back, John Adams and the Sedition Act. aimed at silencing government criticism.
And speaking of historical precedents, let's talk a bit more about that Sedition Act. How does that relate to the whole situation with the AP and the renaming of the Gulf of America?
Well, the Sedition Act, it was passed in 1798, and it made it a crime to publish anything that was, false, scandalous, and malicious against the government. Now, it was mostly aimed at silencing people who opposed the Federalist Party, but it set this dangerous precedent for limiting press freedom. And the AP situation, well, it kind of echoes this tension, maybe in a more subtle way. The White House isn't making dissent illegal, but they are using their power to try and control what people hear and limit the information that the public gets.
So even though it all started with just what seems like a simple name change, it's really about something much bigger.
Exactly. It makes us think about the limits of presidential power, the vital role of a free press, one that's independent. And what does truth even mean in a world that's so divided?
It's interesting, right? This whole thing, it really shows the challenges that journalists face, trying to, report accurately and fairly.
Yeah, the AP wasn't alone in this. The New York Times and the Washington Post, they had the same dilemma. They also chose to mainly use Gulf of Mexico. But they did acknowledge the White House's term, too. Like, they were trying to find a balance.
Right, right. But not everyone did that. I mean, Fox News, they fully adopted Gulf of America.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, that sparked accusations of bias from both sides.
Yeah.
It really shows, I think, how polarized our media has become. Even simple facts, they could be seen in completely different ways depending on your politics.
It's wild, right? Like we're living in parallel universes or something, each with its own set of facts and truths.
Exactly, and that makes it so difficult for people to figure out what's real, what's spin, and what's just plain wrong. It's tough to navigate all that information out there.
For sure. So, did any organizations push back against the White House on this?
The White House Correspondents Association, the WHCA, they represent the press. They condemned the AP ban. They called it a textbook violation of the First Amendment. And they even pointed out the irony that this ban, it actually went against the president's own executive order on promoting free speech.
Whoa. Talk about a mixed message, right? It really highlights that tension between the press and the president.
For sure. That relationship, just by its nature, it's going to have tension. The press, they have to hold people in power accountable. That means, asking tough questions, digging for information, and sometimes, challenging the official story. That doesn't always make you popular.
Right. But that role, the press being like a watchdog, that's super important for democracy, right?
Absolutely vital. We need journalists to be those watchdogs, digging for the truth. Even when it makes people uncomfortable, they have to keep the public informed so people can participate in democracy.
I agree. But it feels like it's getting harder and harder for journalists to do their jobs. There's so much hostility towards the media these days. Not just from politicians, from the public too.
It's true. There's this whole idea that the media is biased, or even the enemy of the people. That phrase has been used a lot, and it's dangerous. And then you add social media to the mix and all the misinformation online. It creates this environment where it's easy to just dismiss any information you don't like, regardless of whether it's true or not.
So, what can we do about it? I mean, as people who read the news, listen to the news, how can we be smarter about how we engage with it?
That's the question, isn't it? Well, I think we need to be much more critical about the information we see. We have to be aware of our own biases, right? We have to question what we think we know and try to see things from different perspectives. We can't just stay in our own bubbles where we only hear things that we already agree with.
Right. And we need to support the organizations and people who are fighting for truth.
Exactly. Journalists, fact-checkers, researchers, educators, they're on the front lines. We need to support them more than ever. Subscribe to good news sources, donate to fact-checking organizations, boost the voices of truth-tellers.
It's important to remember that this isn't just about the media. It's about democracy, our freedom, and being able to understand the world.
It absolutely is. And it starts with us, each one of us. Asking questions, being curious, having conversations. Even when we disagree, we have to be willing to listen to each other and try to see things from each other's point of view.
So let's bring it back to you, the listener. What stands out to you in this whole Gulf of America thing? What do you think about the AP's decision, the White House's response, and the reactions from other countries and organizations?
This whole thing, it raises some big questions, right? About freedom of the press, the power of words, and the responsibility we all have to be careful with the information out there. Do you think the press should be able to use the name Gulf of Mexico, even if the government says not to? Or do you think they should just go along with it, even if it means maybe going against their principles? That's a tough one.
Yeah, there are no easy answers here. It's all about facing these tough choices, not just for journalists, but for all of us as we try to make sense of the world.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how this whole debate about what to call, like a body of water, has turned into this much bigger thing about trust. Trust in institutions, trust in facts. Like, do we even agree on what reality is anymore?
It's true. When we can't even agree on what to call a place on a map, it says a lot about, how divided we are as a society. And it feels like someone's taking advantage of that.
Oh, absolutely. There are people who benefit from all this chaos and confusion. It's like that old saying, divide and conquer, right? And it's working.
So where do we go from here? What can we do?
Well, it's tough, but I think it starts with us, each of us, taking responsibility for the information we see and the information we share.
So, like you said before, being more careful, more skeptical, and trying to see things from different points of view.
Exactly. And we have to support the people who are out there fighting for the truth. Journalists, fact-checkers, researchers, educators, those are the people on the front lines of this.
And they need our help more than ever, I think. It's not enough to just read the news or watch the news. We have to engage with it, question it, and demand better.
Right. We can subscribe to good news sources, donate to fact-checking organizations, amplify the voices of people who are committed to the truth. Every little bit helps.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Gulf of What Now situation, we want to leave you with one final question, something to think about. Imagine you're in charge of the AP. What would you do?
Would you just say, okay, fine, Gulf of America it is, so you can get back in the White House? Or would you stick to your principles, even if it meant less access and maybe some pushback? It's a tough decision.
There's no easy answer. This whole thing, it really forces us to think about these difficult choices, not just for journalists, but for all of us as we try to figure out this crazy, mixed up world.
It reminds us there, freedom of the press. It's not something you just watch. It's something you have to participate in. You have to think critically, and you have to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's hard.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful, and maybe it sparked some important conversations. Keep asking those questions, keep exploring, and keep searching for the truth.